They expected a plea, we offered a principle. The Hall of Concord was built to make voices small, a dome of stone-quiet air, a floor that swallowed footsteps, a ceiling crowded with banners of empires older than our ruins. Ambassador Mara Ellison stood at the center as if on the pitcher's mound of a stadium whose crowd wanted a different game. She didn't raise her voice. She raised a standard. "Earth desires peace," she said, hands folded, eyes steady. "We won't impose on your borders, faiths, or customs. We ask the same. Do not extort our colonies. Do not raid our lanes. Do not test our restraint. We are patient, not helpless." A ripple of laughter slid along the tiers, rich, practiced, diplomatic. The archivist speaker, skin like river stone, leaned forward. "Is that a threat, human?" "It's an oath," Ellison answered. "Peace if you'll have it, justice if you force it." Some delegates smirked at the old-fashioned word. Justice. In the back rows, a few did not smirk. Traders who'd seen human convoy captains refuse bribes. Patrol officers who'd watched damaged corvettes stay to shepherd refugees. Historians who had read about Verdun and Selma and the Berlin airlift and understood the odd alloy of our species. Stubbornness braided with civic faith. Reports from the frontier hung like smoke the council pretended not to smell. Skirmishes at Cedar Ridge, tariffs turned to tribute on Kepri Station, disciplinary actions near the Ararat Gate. The coalition of responsible powers promised to teach Earth proportion. The council, great machine of procedure, nodded, mustn't upset the balance. Ellison's last words fell into the hush. "Do not mistake quiet for fear. In our history, quiet is when we write. No applause, no gavel. Only the sifting whisper of robes as envoys departed to draft condemnations more elegant than honest." On the flight home, Ellison watched the curve of Earth grow out of night. Cities glowed like campfires under an old sky. She remembered a sentence from an American civics reader, corners of the page still torn in school copies back in Cincinnati. "Power is safest when it's answerable to conscience." Deterrence, she knew, is not the love of force. It is the refusal to surrender the innocent to those who love force. In the Pacific shipyards, Admiral Sarah Chen walked past hulls the world had never admitted existed. Their names were not sharp animals or vengeful storms. They were memorials: UES Gettysburg, UES Birmingham, UES Warsaw Rising, UES Kigali Sunrise, steel remembered because people must. On the dry dock rail, a placard bore the fleet's unofficial motto: "Silence is the sheath of the sword." "Politics failed," Chen said to her chief of staff, a former history teacher from Tucson who still spoke like classrooms. "Then we let civics do the aiming." Civics? Consent, limits, proportionality. We'll act as if the whole galaxy is watching a court of law, because they are. The first coalition probe crossed the border at Holiday Drift, a clean test, a lawyer's question. A reply was a lawyer's answer. Recorded warnings, navigational buoys broadcasting open code, de-escalation windows measured in generous minutes. On the third incursion, the probe tried to take a customs cutter alive. The buoy message changed. Boarding an officer of the law is an attack on the law's citizens. The cutter's captain, 27, Staten Island, bled from a split brow and refused to sign a coerced transfer of jurisdiction. Word went back to the council. Earth was performatively legalistic. The old empire smiled. Laws are for the weak. Numbers are for the strong. Numbers arrived. A coalition policing task force raided Cedar Ridge. Farms burned. Miners were marched past their own ore as proof of order restored. The feed filled with triumphant speeches about the value of hierarchy. In response, the human channels went still. No rage. No list of grievances, no scream for allies who wouldn't come. Only one sentence, broadcast once, dead calm in 20 standard tongues. Remember this: silence is not vacancy, it is staging. Freight schedules bent like reeds to make corridors for things that did not officially exist. Civilian couriers changed call signs at dark buoys named for poets. Evacuations ran like metronomes. Elders, archives, children, seed banks. Teachers in Panhandle Colony packed both microscopes and county fair ribbons, the silly and the sacred, because a culture is the sum of what it refuses to leave behind. Philosophy, too, was readied. Chaplains, rabbis, imams, and secular counselors rehearsed the just war questions until they could ask them over engine noise. Right authority, right intention, probability of success, proportional means, last resort. We would not become the thing we fought. We would not win a future unfit for our children to inherit. At the Naval Academy in Annapolis Orbital, a first-year ethics seminar compared Thucydides' line about the strong and the weak with Frederick Douglass's about power conceding nothing without demand. Cadets argued late, faces lit by case files and ramen steam. Consensus emerged like dawn. Deterrence is the art of making cruelty unprofitable without becoming cruel. In the Hall of Concord, they read our quiet as collapse. In our shipyards, we read it as editing. History is a draft. You cut and you sharpen. By the time the coalition finally declared a limited tutelage action against Earth, the ink was dry on plans that looked less like wars and more like proofs. Ellison wrote to Chen in a note with no salutation and no signature. We hold them to standards they mock. That is how you move a world. The answer was only a timestamp and a single word. Understood. The galaxy thought it had measured us by our volume. It never thought to measure our silence. And silence, when it belongs to a people with long memory and longer patience, has weight. They marched into our quiet and heard nothing but their own boots. At Cedar Ridge, the coalition's banners snapped like fresh money in a crowded market. Their officers filmed themselves restoring normal trade beside still smoldering barns. The occupation handbook was thorough. How to seize comms, how to ration food, how to stage a benevolent parade. It had one blind spot. People who do not give you their consent are not yours to govern. On day 3, the school reopened. The teacher, MS. Alvarez, age 49, favorite coffee order scrawled on a chipped mug, had moved class into the grain elevator. Words carried strangely there, bright and hollow. Her students learned civics next to sacks of winter wheat. Habeas corpus, trial by jury, the idea of unalienable. They learned the names of places where law had gone to the wall and law had held anyway. Little Rock, Greensboro, Manila, Sarajevo. At the end of the hour, they practiced something the handbook forgot, singing. This land is your land across interstellar century, made new in a silo under a foreign flag. The patrol officer stationed to monitor morale stood outside, listening, confused. He had never been told a song could be a fortress. Earth's fleets did not surge. They disappeared. The border became a room with the lights off, full of furniture the intruder could not see. Freighters sailed, baited, retreated. Minefields bloomed and closed like schools of fish. Fighters slipped into asteroid belts and refused dogfights they didn't choose. A cutter lured a corvette across a line of dead boys, dead until a sentence of code woke a chain of submunitions that severed the corvette's spine cleanly, as if by a surgeon who wrote poetry. Coalition commanders called it cowardice. Our officers called it economy. A doctor does not punch a disease. A doctor starves it of what feeds it. At Kepri Station, a customs auditor named Huygens, third generation out of Grand Rapids, stood in front of a tribunal that accused him of obstruction of lawful tariff. He refused to sign a confession written in a language he couldn't read. He asked for a translator, for counsel, for a copy of the charges. He asked politely for the tribunal's legal basis. The presiding magistrate laughed and said, "Basis is the number of ships I have." The recording went through a dozen hands and then went everywhere. Conscience has no fleet, but it is contagious. Dock workers turned slow. A coalition crew chief discovered that nothing is heavier than a crate a free person no longer chooses to lift. Philosophy may sound like cloud talk, but in the field it's the difference between a trap and a crime. Admiral Chen briefed her task forces like a public defender preparing cross-examination. Right authority, we are officers of a constitutional union under oversight with warrants. Right intention, restore safety, deter predation, retrieve our people. Probability of success, we don't pick fights we can't finish. Proportional means, our weapons fit the harm, no spectacle for its own sake. Last resort, Exhaust the lawful, then the clever, then the loud. She paused, eyes on the memorial names stenciled along the hangar. In every step, remember, our goal isn't applause. It's a world safe enough that applause would be an embarrassment. The pilots laughed quietly. They understood. A good landing isn't dramatic, it's decent. If silence is a tool, memory is the manual. Humans carried it like flint in a pocket, the grocery list, the eulogy, the treaty, the letter home. In a night convoy above Cedar Ridge, a young logistics officer, foster kid, rock on a Pell Grant, a tattoo of her abuela's recipe for beans, rode a freighter past a line of dark boys and thought of a black pastor in Montgomery telling people to walk rather than ride. Resistance is logistics. You move what matters where it must be. Sometimes that is grain. Sometimes it is courage. 2 weeks into occupation, a single transmission pulsed across coalition bands. No demand, no threat. Only the sentence again. Remember this? That night, power failed for 9 minutes in the barracks and nowhere else. When the lights returned, 14 rifles lay neatly on bunks with their magazines disassembled, each spring kinked in the exact same place. There were no footprints. A reasoned mind would call it sabotage by a disciplined force. The soldiers called it a haunting. Fear is efficient when budgeted well. At the Ararat Gate, 30 coalition hulls assembled to push deeper inland. The gate was a crown of pylons and equations, beautiful in the way a bridge is, a promise of arrivals that haven't happened yet. A human relay tug drifted just outside the safe zone, lights off, the cosmic equivalent of someone sitting on a porch swing when a convoy of bullies rumbles past. The convoy commander cued a demand. Before he sent it, a new light blinked, open channel from the tug. "Good evening," a woman's voice said, calm, a teacher's patience tucked into a pilot's throat. "Please register your passage and state your purpose. This is a lawful movement of forces. Whose law?" Silence stretched. The convoy commander thought of the magistrate's laughter on Kepri and for the first time wondered if it had been recorded. "We will proceed," he snapped. "Understood," the voice said. "Please observe a courtesy protocol while you do." "What protocol? Remember this." A sequence of numbers crawled across his screen, polite as a recipe. His navigator frowned. "What is?" And then the pylons flared, the field inverted, and the convoy dropped not forward but sideways, skidding through the gate's physics like a stone hopping water, safe but shaken, spat out into empty coordinates precisely chosen for the purpose of frightening without harm. There are people who become braver when shot at. There are fewer who become braver when spared. On the far side, the convoy tried to laugh. The sound came thin. The council debated incidents with the serene cadence of a weather report. Ambassador Ellison declined to attend. She walked a seawall on the Chesapeake and thought of words Americans teach their children early. We the people, a more perfect union with liberty and justice for all. Aspirations are not boasts, they are chores. You sweep the floor because you said you would. You defend the innocent because you promised. Quiet tightened like a bowstring. Beyond the moon's dark, ship bones woke and remembered why they were forged. And the Hall of Concord kept misreading the hush, as if a library were proof that nothing dangerous had ever been written inside. They counted ships, we counted consequences. A coalition liaison named Vora's junior grade, eager, curious, kept a private log against regulations. He wrote to a sister on a mining world that never answered. Humans don't move like militaries, he typed, palms sweating in a barracks where the rifle's springs never seemed quite right anymore. They move like neighbors. They're always fixing something while you're watching the wrong thing. They apologize while they frighten you. They remind you to drink water while they make you dread the next hour. Voraz's superiors filed triumphs, patrols through markets, dignitaries touring bakeries that smelled like good order. The camera never lingered on the shopkeeper's eyes. Consent is a kind of light. You can see when it's missing if you've ever had it. At Laurentine Reach, a coalition flotilla pursued what it believed were 6 human corvettes. The corvettes were freighters in decoy skins. The flotilla was a school of knives chasing reflections. When the reflections reached the edge of a debris field seeded months before with drift nets of smart wire, the freighters peeled into a gap whose geometry looked like an accident and wasn't. The flotilla slowed. The nets unspooled. No explosions, no screams, only the quiet insistence of restraint, disable, disarm if the choice exists. 10 ships dead in space. All crews recovered. All crews delivered, intact, fed, furious to a neutral port with a note attached to each manifest. Remember this. The coalition called it piracy. Civilians called it proof of something they couldn't name yet, a force that could hurt and chose not to. Choice is the heartbeat of ethics. You cannot be merciful unless you could be cruel and aren't. In the Pacific shipyards, Chen stood beneath the shadow of UES Gettysburg. Drones stitched black armor that swallowed light. Along the keel, a motto was laser-etched in tiny script: law without memory is theater. Memory without law is vengeance. We will choose neither. The ship's engineers came from every time zone and tradition. Their coffee argued with their sleep. Their hands shook when they first powered the quiet drive, and nothing failed. A chaplain pinned a note near the launch bay. The measure of strength is the good it can afford to spare. It gathered signatures like a petition from the dead we refuse to become. Chen's operations brief named the doctrine openly. The Obsidian Protocol, 3 pillars. 1. Visibility is a weapon. Show as little as needed, then show everything at once. 2. Mercy is leverage. Spare when it terrifies more than it comforts. 3. Law is logistics, every target tied to a public plane violation, every strike publishable in a court of conscience. Deterrence, she told her captains, is applied civics with a timer. They smiled, the nervous kind. War that argues while it fights is harder than war that merely kills. Voraz's log grew stranger. Patrols vanished without flares or funerals. Wrecks coasted into salvage zones with hulls cut as neatly as bakery slices. A barracks woke to find its entire ammunition locker, resorted by lot number and manufacture date, an insult only an armorer would appreciate. Anxiety dripped into the chain of command like a leaky roof. Rumors named a black choir, human ships that sang to each other across the dark in packets of old poetry and court rulings and recipes, a civilization's scrapbook hauled into battle. Someone swore that a carrier launched a barrage of subpoenas ahead of kinetic rounds, attaching evidence bundles to missiles. Nonsense, the officers said. Effective nonsense. When the coalition dragged a human engineer in chains before a camera and demanded a confession of galactic crimes, the engineer requested to know the statute. He pronounced the word carefully, like tasting a foreign dish. "State your law," his captors laughed. The next morning, the entire planetary registry office was emptied of paper and personnel, relocated gently to the parking lot, sorted by alphabet blue tarps covering sensitive records. No doors were broken. No computers were harmed. A note: your laws are safer outdoors than under thieves. The planet's civil servants, who had quietly hated the occupation's contempt for process, began to stall, then sabotage, then simply say no. Consent is a valve. Close it and the machine overheats. On a quiet night above the Ararat Gate, Gettysburg breathed for the first time like a cathedral giving voice to a hymn. Not to fire. To interpose. To block with a geometry so absolute that argument became a physical fact. Physics is not partisan. It is simply stubborn. Chen did not broadcast threats. She transmitted a syllabus. Recording of the tribunal on Kepri, the patrol report from Cedar Ridge, the evacuation ledger of a clinic that had delivered 81 babies under occupation. The packet ended with a single line: "We will not let you make more orphans." The coalition called up its largest armada in 2 centuries. Numbers reassured them. When you believe you are owed deference, quantity feels like justice. Voraz typed to a sister who still wouldn't answer. "If they are what I fear, our math is wrong." His commanding officer shut the terminal and told him to sleep. He dreamed of a classroom in a grain elevator and woke with the taste of a song he had never known on his tongue. Before dawn, scouts reported a debris silhouette behind the moon. Asteroid, they said. Then it moved. Engines lit like dawn seen from the deep ocean. The first thunder hadn't sounded yet. The room was just very, very quiet. They fired at what they could see. We answered with what they could not imagine. The Armada entered the Ararat sector in parade geometry, banners bright on tactical displays, a procession fit for conquest footage. Numbers win wars, an admiral declared over open band, confident as a lecture. Across the shadowed limb of the moon, something the size of a small city pivoted as if space were a pond and it a patient swan. UES Gettysburg did not appear so much as arrive at its purpose. Black plates drank starlight. Along its flanks, veins of controlled fire traced circuits like stained glass in motion. It did not transmit bravado. It transmitted a docket, violations, dates, coordinates, the names of the dead spoken once correctly, as if each were the lid of a box the living had to carry carefully forever. Coalition targeting lit up the void. Beams crossed. Missiles blossomed. Plasma foamed. Against Gettysburg's skin, it looked like honest rain on carved stone. The ship did not flinch. It calculated. Right intention, Chen whispered, more to the room than the recorder. Right authority, her chief affirmed, fingers white on a railing. Proportional means, the weapons officer said and pressed his lips together like a vow. The broadside wasn't a roar. It was a verdict. Lances of energy stitched through 3 cruisers so cleanly that Bo Halves coasted forward with a grace that made onlookers feel vaguely ashamed. A carrier turned to run and discovered that running had been predicted. The space behind it thickened into a net of guided light that nudged, then insisted, then stopped it gently dead and unarmed. In 60 seconds, 10 ships were out of the fight, crews retrieved, wounded stabilized, evidence packets uploaded to their bridges, footage of the tribunal, the farm, the clinic, a little boy's drawing of a planet with a smiley face sticker, the kind teachers hand out for being brave when your hands shake. The Armada's formation buckled. Some captains, competent and unlucky, tried to redress lines. Others shouted. One screamed for unrestricted action. The age-old plea of people who lost the argument and want the furniture thrown. Gettysburg ignored the screams and watched the competent ones. Respect is a kind of targeting solution. The trap did not spring all at once. It breathed. Hidden stations exhaled drones. Cloaked corvettes unfolded like knives from table linens. Freighters sloughed decoy skins and became what they had been trained to be on a day no one wanted to arrive. Across the battle space, 1,000 small, lawful choices assembled into consequence. Publish now, Chen said. Across public bands, the case went live. Charges, proofs, mapped to each strike like captions under photographs in a museum you enter whispering. Civilians watching from neutral ports saw that every coalition ship taken was tied to a prior offense. This one escorted the tribunal. This one shelled a hospital. This one towed farmers through their own fields. The comments flickered in 100 scripts. You could feel consent leaning. A coalition battleship fired at a hospital ship marked in 6 languages. Gettysburg moved between them with an economy of motion so spare it felt like modesty. The battleship's volley struck and guttered against armor designed by people who had read both scripture and statute and asked harder of themselves because their grandparents had once not asked enough. "Return fire?" the weapons officer asked, a thread of anger stitched through his restraint. Chen's jaw worked. "Proportional means," she said again, making the words the handle of a door no one wants to open and still must. The volley that answered left the battleship a lattice of survivable compartments drifting like lanterns on a river. Hours, then less than hours. The Grand Armada lost the pretense of church and became a stampede. You cannot keep a parade square when the street itself chooses not to hold you. Above the moon, Gettysburg cast a shadow that wasn't darkness but shelter. Behind that shelter, smaller human ships did work with the concentration of nurses. They cut, they tied off, they triaged. They spared where it purchased safety. They destroyed where mercy would invite more predation. The calculus hurt. It should. At the fight's edge, a single coalition cruiser throttled down and opened all hatches. Flags of surrender unfurled across light. A boarding team found a young liaison in the CIC with his hands raised and his eyes wet, a private log already queued for transmission. "My sister never answered," he said in halting English learned from contraband entertainment vids. "If you see a registry from a mining world named," the lieutenant leading our team paused. "We'll look," she said. She would. "We do not promise lightly. That, too, is deterrence. Predators study hypocrisy like maps. Consistency is a wall." The cruiser crew was processed, fed, and set to work repairing the damage their officers had ordered into a sky not theirs. One asked why the rations tasted like cinnamon. "Because someone back home thought you might be frightened," a petty officer said, setting down water. "And cinnamon helps." A ridiculous sentence in a war, an unforgettable one in a memory. When the last functional coalition ship fled on a vector that told the truth about courage, a thin line away from others, the public docket auto-updated. Ararat engagement concluded. Losses minimal. Objectives, civilians secured, tribunal evidence served, capacity demonstrated, further action contingent on compliance. No chant, no gloating. Only a transmission from Ambassador Ellison released to civilian channels, spoken once clean. "Peace is a promise we mean to keep, so is justice." In the Hall of Concord, some envoys wept. Not for the fallen, though they should have and some did, but for the thing more frightening than force, legitimacy married to strength. The old world they preferred, where law was costume jewelry on power's throat, had just met a people for whom law was a living oath. Ellison forwarded one line to Chen: "They will call this vengeance." Chen replied, "Only if they refuse to learn the word restraint." Beyond the moon, Gettysburg turned its vast face back into shadow and idled like a courthouse after hours. The stars looked close. They were not. That is why we build bridges. The first thunder faded. The library grew loud again. And somewhere far from Ararat, a factory that made springs for rifles turned off its lights and posted a notice on the door. "Closed until further notice. We have found something better to make." They called our restraint weakness until it priced them out of cruelty. Cedar Ridge did not fall in fire. It rose in paperwork. At dawn, coalition officers found a folded packet on the governor's desk. 37 notarized affidavits, drone footage of illegal seizures, receipts of fees, and a neat ledger of damages calculated at civilian wage rates, annotated with case law from Earth and 3 neutral polities. The first trucks the occupiers saw rolling down Main weren't tanks. They were claims offices. A banner over the grain elevator, MS. Alvarez's new school, read open for redress. On the second day, the policing task force announced curfew. On the third, a convoy of human medical vans arrived and parked nose-to-nose with coalition barracks, unarmed, staffed by nurses whose clipped voices made even soldiers stand straighter. "Vaccinations are public goods," one said, sleeves already rolled. "You're in line after the children." It is hard to posture as a conquering hero holding a lollipop and a tetanus booster. The occupier's handbook had a page on propaganda and none on shame. Admiral Chen's campaign orders were spare. A schedule, a map, a creed stitched through both. Targets, command nodes, depots, the few captains who had made a theater of humiliating farmers and clerks. Not cities, not power plants, not water. "We are here," she told her staff, "to make cruelty unprofitable and dignity cheap." On the wall behind her, the obsidian protocol, 3 pillars underlined until the marker squeaked. In the Pacific shipyards, UES Birmingham took light into its black skin and gave none back. Her motto ran along a rib in letters small enough to demand a reader lean close. "Strength that forgets why it is strong should be afraid of history." The chaplain who had pinned the note by Gettysburg's Bay came by and added another. "Let our victory be the world we can afford to live in afterward." On the first loop of the counteroffensive, Birmingham intercepted a convoy of confiscated farm machinery headed to a coalition world that had never seen a wheat field. The escorts bristled, the way men bristle when caught stealing lunch from a break room. "This is lawful requisition," the captain said. "Whose law?" our comms officer asked, a question we had learned to deliver like a mirror. The convoy fired first, Birmingham didn't. She put nets out like a fisherman with a conscience. And when the last engine sputtered into silence, she broadcast the same 4 questions cadets had chanted until they were muscle memory. Right authority. Right intention. Probability of success. Proportional means. The convoy crews were processed and fed. The tractors went home. The video went everywhere a connection could carry it. Torren Yards, the coalition's spine, spanned a red dwarf like scaffolding on a cathedral. It built carriers that looked good on parade routes and looked worse under fire. Chen could have erased it. The math loved the idea, the ethics did not. Disable, confiscate, and cite, she said, and the room stilled at the audacity of civics in place of spectacle. Our infiltrators switched on every safety interlock the yards had disabled to speed production. Assembly lines kissed to a halt. Robotics froze mid-arc like dancers caught between steps. The only explosions were from administrators' tempers. Dock workers who had whispered their disgust at quota injuries let it become a chorus. Birmingham unfolded a court in the sky, charges, statutes, remedies. Workers came forward with ledgers, thumb drives, and the kind of memory you only share when you feel safe. The coalition called it sabotage. Everyone who had ever worked a shift called it OSHA with artillery. Ambassador Ellison returned to the Hall of Concord not to ask but to serve notice. A scroll, old ritual, new purpose, unfurled across the dais, a bill of particulars. It read like a syllabus and a summons. Points 1 through 6 named the predations we would not let stand. Tribute, forced confession, tribunals without law, armed extortion called tariff, seizure of archives, and harm to hospitals. Point 7 offered terms. Restoration, public repentance, reparations in tools not coin, and amnesty for conscripts who laid down arms. You seek to humiliate us, an ancient envoy rasped. We seek to educate you, Ellison said, and did not smile. We have decided you are capable of learning. In the coalition's press halls, fury sold well until the clips of nurses and tractors and affidavits crossed the border. Then fury began to look like a tantrum. In a cell on a neutral station, Voras, the liaison with the careful hands, sat across a table from a human lieutenant who had seen him raise them in surrender at Ararat. You wrote a log, she said. You saved it when your commander tried to delete it. I wanted to understand, he said, softer than he'd intended, as if the words were heavy and he was afraid of dropping them. You interfere less than you could. We interfere as much as we must, she said. That's supposed to be the point of law. My sister, he blurted. A minor, I send messages and... We're searching manifests, the lieutenant said. It's slow because we're doing it right. Voras nodded. He had not expected cinnamon in a ration bar to become his memory of mercy. He had not expected mercy to frighten him more than fire. He was beginning to respect why it did. Cedar Ridge voted in a packed gym that smelled like waxed floors and new crayons. The ballot was 3 questions long: return to civil policing, reopen the library, replant the North Fields with winter wheat. The tally was unanimous without being forced, which is rarer than any victory measured in hulls. MS. Alvarez dismissed class with homework. Write an oath you can live under and live up to it twice. Kids groaned in the way kids do when they know they are being grown and secretly like it. Mercy had a cost. It demanded patience, paperwork, restraint that made the wrist ache, and risk that could break the heart. We paid it with receipts and with tears and with ships that could have burned brighter and refused. The coalition watched and said we were arrogant. The truth was worse for them. We were consistent. The council called for an equitable cessation. We brought a contract. The chamber felt smaller this time, as if walls curve inward when people have been forced to think. Ellison walked to the center not like a victor, but like a clerk bearing a file. She placed a wafer on the lectern. It projected articles in a cool blue that made even enemies lean forward to see. The Concord statutes read the title. The subtitles were workmanlike: free navigation corridors, sanctuary protections, no taxation by gunship, evidence and appeals, restitution in work goods. A final section in plain type, amnesty ladder. Lay down arms, she said, and walk up. The earliest rung is the lightest. The later rungs carry weight, that is justice tempered by time. You would make yourselves judges, an envoy hissed. We would make ourselves accountable, Ellison said, tapping the last page, the audit clause. We signed to be measured by our own rules. In the gallery, journalists went still. The story was no longer who won. It was what kind of world does the winner intend to live in? That question is rarer than fireworks and harder than flags. While delegates argued adjectives, Chen ran verbs. The second loop of the campaign moved along a pattern that looked to civilians like mercy and to professionals like checkmate. Birmingham and Gettysburg did not bomb capitals. They unplugged capacities. Munitions plants lost power at midnight while hospitals kept theirs. Shipwright guilds woke to find contracts rewritten, pay guaranteed, safety restored, quota penalties voided. Because a labor lawyer from Lagos with a voice like a lullaby had slipped into the yard systems and returned them to what they were meant to be. Shelters for hands, not mills for blood. At Halcyon Forge, a coalition admiral broadcast a challenge. Single combat of flagships, old right, old pride. Chen answered with a tour of a clinic we had rebuilt on Cedar Ridge and a vector to the Forge's payroll server. Fight me in court or in conscience, she said. You pick the ring. He picked silence and a transfer to quieter duty. The feeds called it cowardice. Our pilots called it improvement. Torrens City, capital not of a world but of a habit, floated like a chandelier and behaved like a bank. We came not with meteors but with demands. Open the records. Release the conscripts. Return the archives. The city tried to bargain. We placed a clock on their sky, 24 hours of soft light marking time for mothers who had taught children to count by pointing at stars. Halfway through the first hour, a supply ministry published partial ledgers, enough to prove guilt and not enough to prove courage. At hour 6, a colonel released prisoners chained for refusing to loot. At hour 9, a television anchor cried ugly tears on air and confessed she had lied because the scripts were safe and the truth was not. At hour 10, the city's richest quarter lost power while the poorest kept it, and a rumor grew legs. The human ships had learned the difference between grid maps and neighborhoods. At hour 12, a boy from Cedar Ridge, his hair still clumsy from a gymnasium haircut, read bedtime to the galaxy. A book about a house made strong by neighbors who bring hammers and share soup. The clock kept moving, so did the ledger. At hour 21, Torrens' archives opened like a sea cave at low tide. Names poured into light. People who had been disappeared became present tense. A librarian in a blue sweater with a coffee stain on her sleeve walked the stacks and said titles out loud until her voice broke. We see you, she whispered into a mic meant for state ceremony. We have always seen you. Chen asked for fire mission authority. Ellison shook her head, eyes on the long work. Let the confession be the fire. In quiet rooms that smell the same on every planet, old paper, warm machine, worried breath, diplomats tried to invent compromise. Mutual de-escalation, they said, as if the mugger and the bystander should put back their fists at the same time. Face-saving measures, they said, as if face were a thing you deserved by default, not something you earned when you chose to be decent. Ellison kept saying no the way a doctor keeps saying breathe to a frightened patient. Not louder, more often. The word was not obstinacy, it was therapy. No to tribute masked as tariff. No to secret courts. No to temporary occupation with monuments that look permanent. Yes to corridors with escorts that report to neutral monitors. Yes to a registry of seizures and an order of return. Yes to a truth commission chaired by species who had once done harm and learned, the only credential that matters in work like this. In the pews of public opinion, something like faith began to flicker. Not in us. In the idea that power might be harnessed to principle without snapping the traces. Voras sat at a computer in a processing center where every 10th desk bore flowers from strangers. He sorted names. He cried when he found his sisters, found in a ledger of transfers that had ended in a planet no one visited unless they had to. He sent a message. It returned undelivered. He sent another anyway. He learned, painfully and with gratitude, that hope under rules hurts less than hope under lies. A human clerk brought him tea. "We'll keep looking," she said. "You can curse while we do, we have a room for that." He laughed through salt and asked, half ashamed, "Why are you being kind?" "Because someone was to me," she said, and left him alone with the screen and a cinnamon bun that tasted like mercy taught in a kitchen. At midnight, the council's vote tallied. The Concord statutes passed by the margin history usually reserves for stories that will be misremembered as inevitable. They were not. They were a fight, fought in the open with receipts. The armistice terms traveled faster than any ship. Corridors, audits, restitution, amnesty. Our fleet stayed, not as rulers, as witnesses. The difference is the size of the world you leave behind. And over the Ararat sector, Gettysburg idled like a courthouse with its doors unlocked and lights on, the way a city tells its people they are welcome to enter and argue their case. The last coalition banners did not fall. They were taken down by the people who had been made to stitch them. At Dawnmarket Square on Torrin, a seamstress in a gray apron climbed a ladder with hands creased by a lifetime of mending uniforms that never fit the poor. She cut the cords. The cloth sighed. Children cheered in the unpracticed way that tells you nobody coached it. Behind her, a teacher set up a table and stacked library cards with rubber bands. The queue for books was longer than the queue for bread. This is not common. It is civilization when it works. Our ships did not strafe parades, we escorted ambulances. We did not seize banks, we unjammed courts. In the weeks that followed, the work was so uncinematic an algorithm would have mistaken it for peacetime. Notarize, certify, refund, return, repair. A culture is rebuilt by verbs so small you can miss them if you only look for flags. At Cedar Ridge, M.S. Alvarez's class held a mock council. Children played envoys from species whose names they still mispronounced with dignity. They debated whether a sanctuary corridor should allow armed escorts if the convoy carried medicine. They invented a novelty, nuance, and voted for it. "Write your minority opinion," M.S. Alvarez said to the losing side. "History reads those longer." A boy who had lost his father at the tribunal raised his hand. "Can we also plant the North Fields?" "Yes," she said, voice shaking, "because argument is not the absence of chores." The Ararat hearings opened not with a gavel but with a roll call of the harmed. Names were spoken once, correctly. Evidence followed in the order victims wanted it, not the geometry of lawyers, the geometry of sorrow. An old woman from Kepri, whose hands shook too much to hold a pen, placed a stamp upon an affidavit with the concentration of a surgeon. "Sworn," the clerk said, eyes damp. "Received into record." Military officers who had ordered theatrics learned what records feel like when they describe you. A tribunal magistrate watched footage of himself laughing at the phrase "right to counsel" and aged 10 years in a minute. When his turn to speak came, he did not say, "I was only following." He said, "I chose comfort over conscience." In the silence that followed, Ambassador Ellison closed her eyes like a person who has wanted to hear that sentence her whole life and wasn't sure she ever would. A commission drawn from species who had done harm and then done better wrote opinions that read like sermons and like shop manuals. Remedies were granular, not abstract reparations, but repair, tools for fields, tablets for schools, pumps for water, rails for clinics. The word that kept reappearing was return, not only of goods, of agency. Voras found his sister on the 12th day, not in a cell, but in a shaft 3 kilometers down, where her signal had been eaten by rock and indifference. She was thinner, not brittle. When he reached her, she hit him once, soft, obligatory, then wept into the place on his shoulder where a uniform used to sit. "I thought I was a ledger line," she said. "I thought I was the debt you write off when the quarter needs to look good." He told her about cinnamon and a clerk and a room for cursing. She laughed in a miner's way, from the lungs up. He took her to a claims office that smelled like paper and courage. The form was longer than it should have been and shorter than it had been. At the end, a box, "Do you wish to testify?" She checked YES. When she did, the clerk did the small sacred thing. She looked up and met eyes and said, "Thank you." Gratitude is not payment. It is acknowledgement. Some days it is food. On screens across the polities, pundits hunted for a word that could carry what had happened without melting into myth. Victory was too blunt, justice too proud, settlement too legal. The word that stuck was plain, order, not the brittle kind that requires boots, the kind that lets a child walk to school without counting how many checkpoints stand between home and the alphabet. The Concord statutes moved from treaty to habit. Convoys flew under blue corridors with beacons that reported tampering the way a smoke detector reports fire. Sanctuary planets, hospitals, libraries, seed vaults, drew bright circles on maps and dared the worst among us to cross them. Some tried. They were stopped, filmed, cited, escorted to the newest institution in the sky, a court of the common routes, whose seal showed a bridge and a loaf of bread and a hand open, not clenched. Ellison delivered the closing address of the Ararat hearings to a hall that had learned humility the way old wood learns polish. "We do not forgive on behalf of those we cannot speak for," she said. "We do not forget on behalf of the living who need memory to make decisions. We will carry both. That is the price of being a people rather than a crowd." The hall rose the way people rise when they remember standing is a verb, not a reflex. On a ridge above the Pacific shipyards, Admiral Chen walked the length of Gettysburg and read her own reflection as a waver of darker night on darker metal. A young pilot asked if the ship would become a museum. "Not yet," Chen said. "Museums are for when lessons stick without supervision. And now we keep the doors of the courthouse open." In the distance, cranes swung like metronomes, keeping time for a city that finally had a rhythm worth keeping. The banners didn't ripple. They were folded, carefully, by the same hands that had once been told to iron them flat. The day felt less like triumph than like the end of a long, hard test. The grade would be how we behaved tomorrow. The last broadcasts were not speeches. They were instructions. How to submit a claim if you can't write. Where to find a counselor who speaks your dialect. What to do with a weapon you're afraid to surrender but more afraid to keep. The feeds that had once hummed war footage traded in little lessons. Pressure wash a clinic. Rewire a light. Plant beans in soil tired from grief. This is the part of peace that makes poor ratings and great neighborhoods. Ambassador Ellison's final appearance in the Hall of Concord lasted 8 minutes if you counted the silence at the start and the end. "The Concord statutes will be reviewed annually," she said, "by us and by those we harmed while trying not to. We'll publish our failures. If you wish to copy us, copy that." A delegate asked whether Earth intended to lead. Ellison shook her head. "We intend to be led by the promises we made out loud." Outside, vendors sold cheap flags, a bridge, a loaf, an open hand. Children used the sticks for swords until a librarian suggested they pretend to be bailiffs instead. "Order in the court," one shouted, then giggled when a bird landed on her head as if to bless jurisdiction. At Cedar Ridge, the gym smelled like varnish and hope. MS Alvarez passed back oaths, 8-year-old's handwriting slanting uphill with ambition, and pinched the bridge of her nose when she thought no one was watching. A boy asked if they could take a field trip to see Gettysburg when it retired to museum duty. "If it retires," she said, eyes crinkling. "We don't get to decide when lessons are learned. Do the ships get tired?" Another child asked. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the honesty, "but the names keep them standing." At recess, a counselor taught clapping games that came from cities the children had never heard of. The games fit their hands. That is the nature of good inheritances. Voras and his sister stood in a line at a window that opened on the stars. He had clipped the little cinnamon wrapper into his log as a bookmark. "What will you do?" he asked. "Work," she said. "Mine rock that doesn't hide people. Maybe sit on tribunals for minors who get treated like ledger lines." She paused. "What will you do?" "Send this log to the Court of the Common Routes," he said. "Ask them to file it under lessons." "What lessons?" "That mercy scares bullies. That law frightens thieves. That cinnamon makes war taste like something you don't want to remember but should." They laughed the way healed ribs allow, carefully, then freely. Admiral Chen signed a letter that would live in textbooks. A recommendation to lay Birmingham up at anchor and to keep Gettysburg on the blue corridors until auditors from 3 species certified that the temptation to backslide had been replaced by the habit of doing right. She added a paragraph in her own hand. If we ever love being strong more than we love being decent, send us home. If we balk, cut our fuel. The chaplain pinned one more note in the bay. Silence is not the absence of policy. It is the presence of trust. Engineers rolled their eyes and signed it anyway, the way practical people sign things when they know the sentiment is soft and necessary. On a pier that once smelled like fear and now smelled like coffee and salt, Chen watched cadets swear to both a Constitution and the Concord Statutes. She remembered a civics book from Cincinnati and a sentence she had underlined until the paper tore. Power is safest when answerable to conscience. She did not know who had written it. She had learned to live as if it were binding. Ambassador Ellison walked a seawall at dusk. A gull kited above the long gray water, vernacular of tides translating grief into routine. Her wrist chimed. A message from MS Alvarez's class. Thank you for the corridors. The children had drawn a bridge. It looked like a smile someone had engineered on purpose. She sent back a video from a library on a sanctuary planet where a bailiff, 12, serious, rapped once on wood and announced, "Be seated," to a room that had already chosen to sit and listen. She thought of the first day in the hall when laughter had sounded like furniture being dragged. She thought of the first "remember this" sent into a night that felt bottomless. She thought of cinnamon and clinics and ledgers and the fact that we had learned to keep records, not to hold grudges, but to hold ourselves. The sea said nothing wise. It doesn't have to. It keeps time. Our final transmission was 6 words, no music, no flag. We are quiet because we can. It ran on a loop lower than the news tickers, lower than weather, low enough to feel like a heartbeat in a room where someone you love is sleeping. We folded ships into orbits where they were easy to count and hard to fear. We published audits that made us flinch and fixed what they named. We wrote down the names of the dead once correctly and carried them like a handle on the future. We planted the North Fields. We reopened the library. We stamped sworn on things that needed the dignity of ink. Somewhere far from Earth, a seamstress took in a uniform at the shoulders so a young officer could breathe. Somewhere closer, a miner testified and was believed. In a classroom under a banner that said open for redress, children traced letters that would one day form laws. If anyone ever asks what power sounds like after it has learned its lesson, tell them it sounds like doors unlocked, like ledgers balanced, like laughter that isn't cruel. Tell them it sounds like a library. And if anyone ever asks what we said to end the war, tell them we said what we had said at the start, but softer, because softness carried farther now. Remember this.